The new idea of aging is that it's not just random stuff going wrong. It's that there's actually a program that begins at birth. What happens during birth and prior to that is that cells gain an identity. We start as a stem cell that's fertilized, and these cells get different identities. Brain cells, skin cells, liver cells, everything that makes our body up, the many thousands of different types, tens of thousands actually, are given their cell type specificity by turning on different genes out of the same genome. So
through epigenetic signalers.
It's called epigenetic. Yeah. That the epigenome is the regulator of the genome. And the epigenome is not as easy to describe as the genome. The genome is just a chemical with 4 letters, 4 chemicals that is the instructions. But then there's a computer that reads that software called the epigenome. Or we also use the analogy, the reader of the compact disc, that old device we used to fit like 20 songs on. It was really exciting. But what we can now do, instead of 20 songs, there's 20,000 genes. But the reader is the epigenome. And over time, by that analogy, aging is due to scratches on the CD, and you cannot read the right songs at the right time. And a brain cell, over time, starts to play the music of a liver cell or a skin cell and doesn't function as well. And we get diseases of aging, including Alzheimer's, as a result.
In the last episode, we said that it appears that skin ages faster than most other systems in our body, and we can use these clocks also, and have used these clocks to measure aging in the brain. And when we measure aging in the brain, we find something really interesting.
That the brain ages slower than the rest of the body.
Like significantly slower. Your brain is very good chance that your brain is biologically younger than you are.
Well, thank goodness, because it's the most important organ. Without a functioning brain, we're really quite useless.
So one of these studies was led, actually a couple of these studies was led by your friend and sometimes collaborator, Steve Horvath.
All right, before I get into Steve Horvath's work on the cerebellum, important stuff, let's talk about how that clock is actually measured, because that'll be important later for when we talk about diet. Steve measures the methylation on the DNA. It's a chemical called a methyl that the cells add to the DNA, and it sticks there, it doesn't wash away, and it makes sure cells have their identity and play the right genes for the rest of your life. The problem is with aging, that changes, and you can measure that. In my lab, we can do it for about $1, and then the readout tells you, okay, that brain, even though the person is 40 years old, actually is 50.
But you could look at the liver and you could see that the liver is actually 55, and you could look at the skin and say, oh, the liver is actually 62 in equivalent numbers. Horvath and his associates looked at tissue samples from a 112-year-old woman, and they measured the clock in all these different parts of her body, and the regions of the brain were all much, much less methylated than her other organs. So that was the first study. And then they've done other studies. Just a few years later, they did a study that showed across a lot of samples, predicted age is lower in the brain than really anywhere else in the body, sometimes just like a quarter of the age of other parts of the body.
Well, there's a practical and an evolutionary explanation for those. The practical one is that our brain is protected. There's a blood-brain barrier. It doesn't get hit by UV light like our skin does.
We have these big, thick skulls.
We're basically lollipops on a stick. But our brain needs to be protected from these toxins that are in the environment and, of course, anything that leads to brain aging. But, of course, our brains will still age. DNA breaks, we've talked about. Broken chromosomes accelerate that clock. And this happens naturally, even to cells that don't divide, including neurons, the nerve cells in our brain.
One thing to note is that cellular turnover is relatively low in the brain. So even though these cells, even if they're not dividing, they still do age. That process of slow cellular turnover could explain some of the reasons why the brain doesn't differentiate as fast as other regions in the body.
Yeah, that's probably right. Unlike the liver, you can cut a piece out, it grows back. The brain doesn't easily do that. There's a little neurogenesis, as we call it, but mostly those nerve cells are going to be there for your whole life. And so they have these super protective mechanisms, these adversity systems that keep the brain younger for longer. But they're not perfect, of course. We do have an aging brain, but there are ways to turn on those defenses greater than they naturally would be activated.
And so all of this is the good news. The good news is, in general, our brains age more slowly than the rest of our bodies. The bad news, as we said at the beginning of the show, is that we are living longer. That's actually good news too, but it's got a bad news component because our bodies are now outliving, in some cases, our brain. The average onset of dementia is 80 years old, and in most advanced nations now, the average lifespan is more than 80 years old. And so what that really means is that more and more of us are living with dementia at the ends of our lives and other cognitive impairments, that's a terrible fate. That's something that we should all be working to prevent.
Well, that's why I work on aging and not Alzheimer's disease or cancer specifically. As we've said in earlier episodes, by working on aging, we can keep the whole body young, including the brain, which is really what we want to do if we want to have maximal gains in longevity and health and mental capacity right up to the end.
And again, there's not, because you work on the whole body, you're not working on the whole body when people become old. We're talking about the whole body across the span of a human life. And there are advantages to that too, because everybody suffers some cognitive decline. This is a little terrifying. The volume of the brain after the age of 40 reduces about 5% per decade. And that's got cognitive implications for all of us as we enter what's, used to be called our middle years.
Well, yeah, I'm 52. I can already feel it happening. But I'm doing certain things in my lifestyle. We're going to tell people about some of those things you can do to slow that process down and even reverse it later in life.